Hey, welcome back to the Keel Kayaks Workshop. I'm Nick Schade and this is episode 4 of building the Petrel. This is a strip-built sea kayak. It's one of my favorite designs to paddle. I've got a strip-built version as well as a stitch and glue version. I've actually built a skin-on-frame version for a customer, but I don't really have plans for that yet. So in the last episode, I stripped up the hull most of the way. I got the bottom stripped halfway across, and I sort of left a ragged edge. This is fairly typical of how I've been stripping up the bottom of boats now, but what I'm going to be doing in this episode is a little bit different from what I've done before. It's an idea I got from Dan Kayak of Clearstream Custom Watercraft. He's a builder up in Berlin, New Hampshire, does really nice boats, and I'd seen him in a Facebook or Instagram post do something along the lines of what I'm doing here. He stripped up both sides, left a rough center line, and then it ran a router down the middle, and that cleaned up that rough center line, and he was able to drop a strip of wood in between there to make a nice, tight, straight keel line strip, and it really looked good and went really quickly. I'm taking that idea and doing something a little bit different, basically the same idea, but to save a little bit of time on the fitting of that center line, the keel line, I've set up the fence right after doing the first side, trim that first side straight. Now I have a space there that I can use to have a fairly rough center line. Then I run the router again and end up with a precisely dimensioned width strip that I can drop right in there, and the bottom's done. It's really kind of a cheat. Again, I captured this video about a year ago, and since then I've done this a couple times in class on a canoe and a kayak, and it's really kind of cheating. I'm debating whether I should do it in class anymore because it's sort of a little bit too easy and doesn't give people a chance to learn some of the nuances of fitting strips together. But that said, if you don't want to deal with that fussy task of fitting strips together, this is one way to avoid some of that. As I mentioned in the last video, I was having some audio problems. I've now figured out what the problem is. My little lavalier mic, the wires for that were fraying and shorting out and creating a lot of static. So I've placed an order for a new mic, and that'll be coming in shortly. Hopefully that'll clean up the sound, but unfortunately it'll only clean up the new sound. All of this video for this whole build was captured with that old mic, and so there'll be times when I just have to cut to music because the grating of the shorting out wires was a little bit too much to handle. So instead of hearing the natural background sounds, I'll drop in a little music to make it a little less grating. So with that said, and without any further ado, let's get right to it. So I trimmed the center line by setting up a fence here and then running a router down that fence. I transferred the center line up to the outside of the strips using a little jig to take the center line here and mark it on the outside. I've got a 3/4 inch diameter pattern bushing on the router, and so I wanted to center the router on that center line. And to do that, I measured out 3/8 from the center line and put this fence along that 3/8 line. I wanted to keep this fence level, so I made little wedges to go under the fence and glued those wedges down on top of some tape so I can peel them off without making a mess of the wood. There's a few places where the tape and glue weren't quite strong enough, so I ended up with some clamps there. And then I just ran down that center line. So right now I've got a straight edge here cut about 1/8 of an inch from the center line. I used a 1/4 inch diameter router bit centered on that center line, so it's 1/8 inch on each side. I'm now going to fill up strips from the chine here up to that center line, but I'm not going to attempt to make a tight fit. I'm just going to make sure that I don't have a gap greater than a 1/4 inch. So then I'll come back after it's all stripped up, recut that center line with that same router, and then I can just drop a 1/4 inch wide strip into that gap. That's the plan. I want to try and keep this fence in place while I do it, so when I go to recut the center line a second time, I don't have to be accurate in trying to replace that fence in the same place. It's still in the same place, and hopefully it'll stay there. I might have a little bit of an issue at each end here where it's sprung up a bit, but hopefully I'll get it on the majority. And there's some places here at the ends where the fence wasn't close enough to the strips to actually cut all the way down, so I'll just take and saw those off. And this area will get covered with an outer stem anyways. So we'll see how it goes. So to fit these strips in, I'm just fitting them loosely, but they do need a taper at the end in order to fit against the pre-existing strips. So I just butt this up against the end of the little point there, mark where it hits the other strip on the other side, then mark that taper. And I'll just use my jackknife to quickly hack off that little point. Bring it right down to the line. Make the line disappear. And just test that fit. See if it looks decent. I just don't want any gaps greater than a 1/4 inch wide. Alright, so I got that just nestled in there. I'm going to clamp this off to hold it in place and come back to this end here. So at this end, I'm just going to loosely gauge the length. Cut it off. Approximate the taper here. Something like that. Mark that. And we'll just hack that off with a jackknife. Just do a quick dry fit at both ends. Got it fit at the far end. Got it fit back in here. And staple it all home. Then grab the next strip. Router didn't get all the way up to the stem here, so I'm just going to use the little mini shoulder plane from my robo bevel and see if I can just extend that a little bit farther. I don't need to make it go all the way. I can have an outer stem come up here and that should take care of it. But this robo bevel is 1/4 inch wide. Just follow right down that groove and deepen it a little bit. So with the cheater strips, I'm just following the existing strips and fitting in to the shear strip. So the point of this is, I think aesthetically, it just looks better to have the strips running closer to parallel to the water line, instead of sweeping up too much. If you have all the strips following the shear, it kind of starts to look like a banana. And it just happens to be easier to fit into. So I'm fitting this against the cove on the bottom, and I'm going to be cutting away at this edge here and fitting that into the cove on the shear strip. So on this edge, that when I taper this back, I will be able to just use a block plane to cut a little bead on there and make it fit tightly into that cove. So these are just some of the cutoffs from working on the bottom. I'm going to take one that's more than long enough. That way I can just slide it in to adjust for any mistakes. With the Micro Bootlegger Sport, I was book matching everything, and if on this boat I were book matching, I'd want to end up with the patterns on this strip matching the strips on either side of it. So in other words, I'd want to have it fit in precisely a longitudinal orientation on the boat. But here, it's random colored strips. I just need to make it fit tight up into here. So if it doesn't fit right, I just keep on shaving it down until it does. So that might mean I push this a bit in, but that's okay. I've got plenty of room to do that. And this first strip fitting in is always the hardest because it's the longest taper. Basically, it tapers down to nothing up here. And we want to make that nice tight all the way into there. So coming from here where it's where the strip first hits the shear line, it's going to be a long gradual taper. So just putting that strip in there, I'm going to mark it right here. That's where we want it to hit. The other thing to think about is you can always make it tighter by jamming it in or pushing this shear strip up to touch. But we've got this shear strip at a nice fair curve. We don't want to mess with that curve. We want to keep the natural curvature of that and fit this strip to that and not depend too much on the flexibility of these strips to make a tight joint. So first thing I'm going to do is just mark out this taper, and on this one, since it's a long taper, I'll take it over the bandsaw, roughly cut it, and then start planing away at it. After that, I'll be able to just use a jackknife to cut everything down, fit it in, and as I get closer and closer to the tip, it gets easier and easier because the taper's shorter instead of longer. So with that, I've got the bottom of the boat all stripped up. If you've paid attention to the clock in the background of some of those time lapses, you saw I was able to lay a strip like every 5 minutes or so, really moving pretty quickly. Again, unlike some of the previous builds where I was doing book matches and so forth, here I'm just laying down random colored strips and putting them in quickly. And since I had the cheat of that router trick, I wasn't even doing precise fitting. I'm just getting them loosely in place, then using the router to make a nice tight fit. This process, the strips went down really pretty quickly. The total stripping time here was, I didn't actually time it, but 4 or 5 hours to get all the strips on there, including the cheater strips at each end. So it went really pretty quickly. So in the next episode, we will be working on stripping up the deck. I'm not sure how many episodes that's going to take. I haven't looked at how much video I've got there, but I'll plan to have that be 1, maybe 2 videos showing the process of stripping up the deck. We'll see how long it takes to get it all on. So until then, if you'd like to support these videos, really the best way is go to my website. If you're interested in building a boat, buy a set of plans. I've got plans for this boat as well as a bunch of other kayaks, both strip built and stitch and glue. I've got some canoes and some rowing boats. These are all boats I've designed myself. I'm somebody that likes to get out in the water in a small boat, and so my specialty in boat design is these small car toppable small boats. And what I really like to do with that is get people like you interested in building your own boat, and that's kind of the point of these videos, is to share my experiences with building these boats and get you interested in doing it yourself, because it's a really gratifying project. There's really something special about being out on the water in a boat you've built yourself. So if you'd like to support these videos, again, buy plans. If you want to directly support these videos, I've got a Patreon site where for $1 or $2 a month you can just chip into doing things like, I need a new microphone. Microphones are $80 to $100. So your contribution to the Patreon site helps pay for some of the expenses of making these videos. I do them anyways, but with your support, it's easier for me to justify all the time and the expense it takes for me to put these videos together. And the more support I get, the more capable I am of getting these videos out regularly, on time. Again, I captured this video about a year ago. I've had so many other things taking higher priority that I've had to leave the production of this video until I had the time for it, and just other things are taking priority. The more support I get from you, the higher priority I can put on these videos. Otherwise, if you don't want to spend any money in any way, that's fine. Just hit like, subscribe to my videos, hit notifications so you know when the next one's coming out. And until then, thanks for watching and happy paddling.